All right, everybody, welcome to the next episode of the Connecting with Country podcast. Honor to be able to share some space today with Wiradjuri architect and all-round legend Samantha Rich. She's going to spend some time with us today talking all things design, place, country, culture, and like all our other episodes, bit of a deep dive into what all that sort of stuff means. So over to you, Sam. I might just give you a brief minute to say hello and connect with everyone that might be listening along online.
And then also working in research, looking at housing need for the Yuwaya Ngarra-li partnership, which is between Dhariwaa Elders Group and
Yeah,
USW,
awesome. And
you
I'm
are
glad you
really
touched
well
on that
aware of,
work that you've been
and
doing with
kind of
the
work
Dhariwaa Elders
both
group in
in
Walgett,
research
and
and
that's where
practice
we
in the
first
same
met and
area,
first
which kind of
connected
makes it a
there.
lot easier.
They've been doing some
I have
amazing
worked
work
in,
the community of Walgett
kind
there
of
for a
cultural
long time now,
consulting
and
and
seeing a big
research
impact in a lot of
as
different
well,
ways through
with different
the holistic
firms,
way that
and
they're
obviously
partnering
do
with and
it
working with
for my
community
own
there
firm
too.
as well. So,
It's a, sort
and
of
yeah,
maybe a bit of a good
do
segue
lots of
because,
things.
funnily enough, like we booked in this podcast, you know, a while back now, but during that time, I saw a article come up about you, the work that you've been doing in the Dhariwaa Elders Group space, and you were recently awarded the Andrew Taylor Memorial Prize Award at UNSW. Is that correct? And was this work part of your master's thesis or part of that project? Can you talk us through it a little bit and what you think the impact's been and the processes looked like?
That is correct. Yes. Yes, of course. Um, to begin with, I started to kind of get introduced into Yuwaya Ngarra-li during the COVID pandemic, when the need for isolating away from families so that we didn't kind of increase the spread um, became really kind of evident in terms of lack of, safe, affordable, healthy housing. And so I was lucky enough to kind of be brought in um, to work on that. And it kind of became the stepping stone for me to be able to have the amazing opportunity to do my master's thesis on a housing need which is needed in the community. So I've kind of done multiple things. So even when I was doing my master's, I was working on young people's housing need and looking at the correlation between young people's housing and their contact with the criminal justice system. And then for the masters, I looked at elders housing, so kind of ways of being able to allow elders to age well in country. So the kind of idea behind that, both of the research topics that I've looked at
Absolutely.
with Yuwaya Ngarra-li have been drawing upon this amazing foundation of work that's been done over the many years that it's been set up and by previous researchers, as well as the amazing group of elders, as well as the staff up in Walgett So really kind of recognizing that I would never be able to do what I've been doing without all of that extra work and knowledge. And so the Elders Project is based on this Aging Well community report that had been done by the Yuwaya Ngarra-li team around what does it look like to age well in community, using Walgett as a case study. And so drawing on that research and all of these kind of conversations that have taken part ahead of my time, I could kind of start to build upon that and look at, from a housing perspective, what does this look like? So the main kind of theme for it was reciprocity, and drawing upon these relationships of reciprocity and care that exist within our communities to kind of care for our elders, but also ensuring that other relationships of care and reciprocity are continued as well. So both in that really important kind of knowledge transfer, as I think Auntie Virginia said, and Uncle Clem as well. I think all of the elders have said that it's really important as an elder, the responsibilities of imparting all of this knowledge that they have been gifted from their elders and from their community, and imparting that to the younger generation. And obviously, as soon as elders are taken out of the community for health reasons or because they don't have sufficient housing to support them, it means that becomes disconnected and that knowledge is disrupted and lost. So kind of really drawing upon that, and also just looking at, the facilities in place that are already kind of really working really well. Dhariwaa Elders Group is an amazing Aboriginal community controlled organisation which, facilitates all of these connections and relationships and care for the elders. And so just kind of how can housing support that? And so, on top of that, the other concept, because in this kind of design world, you have all of these, concepts that really fuel what's happening. And so it was both reciprocity, but also the idea of the river, because a big thing for the elders was creating these connections between each other, but then also between their community. And the river is such an important kind of part of, our story. It's our life, it's our connection, healthy river, healthy country, healthy community. And so I was like, this really kind of needs to be like the river. And because some of the elders were also saying that they wanted to be on the river and live on the river because that's where they feel at home. And it's really important that from a design perspective, we support these notions of what home feels like from a cultural perspective.
Wow.
Then, trying to kind of, in a sense, recreate that sense of a river or a riverbank where, a riverbank is full of activity, and it's where you kind of come and you stop and you interact. There's all of these animals coming along, and, it's where life happens. So kind of really trying to draw upon that. So, I mean, it was an easy project in the sense that because I was completely guided by the community, it made my job so much easier. Whereas in a lot of kind of design studios that you get given, it's all kind of hypothetical and you don't get to engage with your client, and there's a lot of assumptions that you have to make on behalf of who you're working for. And whilst it's really difficult to always have that connection with the community because there's a lot of burden,
it's an important point you touch on, right?
Sometimes it also prevents you from actually, listening properly,
in a community
which is
like
something that we really need to kind of develop as designers working in this
resources
space.
and guidance and partnership in a way
it also means that you start to kind of
with that
have
community
this
to get to
perception
that
that potentially you
design
can
stage
design
where
without
you're at
them.
now. And
And
you're
that
right.
it's
So
not
often it's
the reality
whether it's
at
design or
all.
planning or whatever part it might be, it's you're not always that blessed, are you, to try and navigate that our space, where we talk about connecting with country as a framework, or trying to embed, um, principles and knowledge into concepts and design and place and things like that. Have you coming away from the Walgett stuff? Have you had other examples where um, work has happened well, where maybe you haven't had as well of a as well like the ingredients you had in Walgett that made that so successful? Is not like we just said, is not common practice, not always readily available. So have there been other examples where you haven't been as well resourced, but you've still been able to achieve, what you think is some good outcomes in that sort of lens? Yeah, totally. Yes, absolutely.
Yeah, definitely. I think it the Yuwaya Ngarra-li partnership is so amazing, and it almost kind of ruins you for the rest of your practice because it's you have this like super high standard, and also you're not kind of driven by the wrong things like money and time pressures and things like that. So it's one of those things where I do have to kind of take myself down out of the clouds and just be like, okay, what does it look like, and what is actually really positive, rather than being kind of too much, this is how I do it in the other realms of my work. But I think that, definitely, working at Yindiamarra previously, we we did lots of, connecting with country consulting and things like that. And I think, working for an Indigenous business like that is really helpful because, you're driving what it should look like. You're talking to knowledge holders, you're translating it, you're bringing it back to them, you're having these kind of open, clear communications, you're bringing them into meetings, where it's relevant. So you're not kind of like overdoing it, and but also you're doing it properly with kind of these feedback loops. You're always kind of pushing for better practices, and so I think, yeah, definitely, a lot of these connecting with country consultants that are coming out from this new framework have really been doing amazing things. And I think the more that Indigenous voices and design practitioners and built environment professionals in general are kind of leading these projects,
Absolutely.
the better outcome and process and methodology will kind of come out of
Absolutely.
it. Because I
And,
think that, you know, because we have a cultural kind of insight into how we should work, and we
mm,
also have cultural
and there's a
responsibilities.
nuanced point you sort of
I know
touch
for
on there
sure
about
that I'm not going to
as
go
black
to a
followers going
community and
into other
act in a
people's
way
like
that,
communities and country. And
is it going to
because
be
connecting
negative
with
towards that
country as a
community because I
framework
know
and
like I
and
can't
the consulting
walk
need that's
around
growing
and
as
do
a
whatever
result of
and
that.
walk away
I
with all
think
of
one
this
of the myths
information that
that
I've come back.
is often,
So I think,
not sort of
yeah,
myth, but maybe like
everyone in this
um,
space like is doing such good
sort of
work. It's hard to
capability
kind of
development that we
pinpoint
try and share is
one
that like
person.
it's not as easy as just engaging an Aboriginal consultant or firm sometimes to go into a community that we may or may not have any connection to whatsoever. And so sometimes there's this expectation that if you're an Aboriginal consultant that you can just straight away walk into anywhere and start doing that work. And in many ways, it's the same sort of process whether you're a non-Aboriginal person in terms of probably a little bit quicker as blackfellas in terms of doing that work, but we still have to go through the same processes in many ways in terms of building trust, rapport, and connection as well. So, um, yeah, I think you touch on it. That's like one of the sort of nuances that we're seeing too. Like with that sort of space, and it's interesting, right? Like with the there is a that's one of the reasons why I wanted to kick off this podcast series and yarn to people like yourself because there over the
Yeah.
last 12 months there has been such a growing need in terms of this work. but I've really felt like I've noticed a real difference in terms of how people interpret and understand what connecting with country means. And so like that's why these yarns are so valuable because it really helps people that are listening along understand um, the I guess diversity of thought and practice that goes into this work, whether you're a designer, whether you're a planner, whether you know whatever sort of lens you're looking at this sort of work, whether you're Aboriginal or non-Aboriginal as well, is all
Yeah.
really critical. And I think that I was on a call a while back now, and they were asking me about some work, and one of the people on the call was like, "Oh, um, there's so much need for this work, and there's not enough." Black fellas working in this space. And I was like, look, that's fair. Um, and I was like, but the reality is as well is that non-Aboriginal professionals need to start to build their capability around how to engage in this space. It should always be black fellas that are leading this work, but where possible, you're going to have non-Aboriginal people working in this space as well. And the reality is that we want to also build capability of those professionals to be able to go in and do no harm, and add value
Yeah.
and do that work in a safe and respectful way as well. So yeah, I think you touched on some really good points with that sort of stuff. Do you think there's any ways that we can do things better? Like you touched on, like I think that Yuwaya Ngarra-li example at UNSW is a really perfect example of when projects are community led. So like when something's community led, that so often they're not the buy-in, the resources, the work is there to progress that. But in our worlds, for the most part, the work that we're engaged to do is not always community led. It's led by other, um, you know, uh, processes too. So, have you got any sort of reflections on where things can be done better sometimes? And you don't have to talk about specific examples or anything, but maybe just broad ways that people listening along might be able to take some things to think about. Yeah,
Yeah. Yeah, I think it is really difficult because obviously it's still classified as a draft framework, so it's still kind of it's a trial, we're all testing it out, and we're trying to kind of figure out how it's working, and how it's not working, or how it's, how we're getting barriers. And I think that a lot of barriers that I've found have been in that it's not kind of trickling down to other kind of levels. So, you'll have policy frameworks like, the Development
yeah,
Control Plan, a DCP, which kind of says a different thing from what, you're suggesting to, as a connecting with country consultant, if that's your role, you're suggesting something and they're like, the DCP says I don't have to do that. Or the, LEP maps, that are kind of telling me, where I can build, how I can build. That's also telling me that I can still do whatever I want, regardless of what you said. So I think that there's things like that we need to kind of trickle it down to every level
absolutely.
so that there's no kind of blockage in terms of people kind of implementing recommendations,
Mm.
especially kind of in this development side of things where, you know, a lot of our processes, in projects, or not ours, but like a lot of development processes are kind of based on economic factors, money, and kind of just rolling things out business as usual. And as soon as, you saw even just with them trying to kind of implement
Absolutely.
like white roofs over dark roofs, like it's the simplest change, but they didn't want to have to do it. And it's, the difference could be,
Yeah,
so incredibly high and kind of helpful that but why don't we do it? It's because, there's pushback and, oh, we have to, you know, change something and that will cost money. So I think having policy support everything would be amazing.
I
I
love
think
that.
also, putting more emphasis on process rather than always on outcome. And process can entail like building relationships, and that it doesn't necessarily have to always be, X, Y, and Z is you can see in the building, but it actually potentially is about the strong relationships that you've created with a community. You've throughout the entire process, you've let them know exactly
Absolutely.
what's happening, how it's been translated, and they're saying this is okay, this is, things like that, or, through the entire process, their, ICIP is protected and, it's treated in a certain way. So I think processes really needs to, and it is shifting, but I think,
Mhm.
it needs to be pushed a bit further, especially in terms of timelines, because you tend to get timelines which, are kind of really unrealistic with working with community and building relationships. Um, and then I think, sometimes in a lot of these new projects, the need for a connecting with country kind of consultant is only, until maybe design development. And then it's like, well, what's happening for the rest of that project? And, as you're saying, non-Indigenous practitioners can be practicing that, especially if in projects they're not
Mhm.
stipulating that you need to be kind of carried through until the end of the project, then, is it possible to hand over that design intent and have that, um, you know, non-Indigenous practitioner to kind of follow through and make sure that, like with a building, when it's being built as an architect, you say, this is my design intent and this is what I want it to
That's
do, and
it.
they're
That's what we're
contractually
here.
obligated to do that or similar, then potentially having that in place for a connecting with country kind of consultancy, so that that they're not going to turn around and change that later down the line when you've been kind of taken off the job. Um, and finally, sorry, I think just so there's so many things. I think just having having more value in
Mm.
cultural heritage in terms of kind of our more than human communities. And I have a friend who's working on a project, and they found something in the um, kind of building and construction of the basement, and there's nothing stipulated that this item is of value. And it's an old mangrove, and
Totally.
it kind of talks
Absolutely.
to like the connection between saltwater and freshwater, and it's a brackish space. And they kind of
Yeah.
all they had to do was to kind of keep it and acknowledge that this is sacred and really important, because all the stories had said that this is the location, and it's not a it's not by chance that they find that that is there in on that site of that place. But there's nothing to protect that, because our cultural heritage at the moment still is kind of undervalued. And I think valuing that more, and valuing more than built objects, like
Absolutely. I
trees
think
and
you touched on a
ecological
couple of
communities
really
and
significant things there.
waterways, like
I
giving
think,
personhood to
yeah, the cultural
waterways so that
heritage
we are
stuff
kind
is
of actually
significant, right? It's
protecting them
but I think it does
and
point
making
to,
sure that we're caring for
I
them
guess,
in any
an
kind of
undervaluing in a broader
development
sense
that we're
of
doing,
what
I
this sort of
think
stuff
would really
represents
be
for
super
country
meaningful,
and
and it's so
for
important,
place. So
to that
I think
continual
for
care
anyone
for our
listening
place,
along,
for this place.
that's on that journey or thinking about this sort of work, it's about really starting to connect with and understand the significance of our culture and our history here, and how to look at any way to um, maximize the inclusion, representation, voice of that through any stage, whether that's stipulated in policy frameworks or not, recognizing and understanding the inherent, I guess, responsibility we've all got, as people here on this country to be able to try and do that. And hopefully we start to move in that direction as opposed to against it. It's always traumatic for a lot of blackfellas when we hear stories like that, where parts of our heritage and culture has been, um, you know, disregarded or disrespected or not given um, the treatment that it deserves. So I think that's a
Yeah.
big piece that we'll probably. I want to try and get somebody on in the heritage space in one of the later episodes to try and do a bit of a deep dive into that. But I think you touched on a really critical point that people need to be conscious of as well. Um, and I really love what you said about the process versus the outcome, because I think that's really critical for people listening along. Like so much of the work and the projects that you might be on and working towards is outcome driven. It's the reality for many of us as well. But the most significant part of getting to that outcome is the relationships and connections and engagement that you have with our communities. And in the long term, that's what's going to be the most meaningful and significant, and also potentially has the opportunity to really add value to that work for the longer term as well. When you start to think about other things that might happen in that place or through that project as well. And so I think that sort of leads me in asking you about community engagement and Aboriginal community engagement, and I guess advice or guidance that people might have listening along. You talked a little bit earlier about some of the work, I think, with Yindiamarra or somewhere else that you might have been doing some stuff with where you've had to do similar sort of work like that. Have you got advice for multiple people working in this space that are listening along that might be able to think about some, best practice or, key steps that they need to start to know?
Yeah. Yeah. Um, so I guess with Ginjama it was a bit easier because Danielle Homrick, she has elders from this place, and as kind of you were saying that even as an Aboriginal Wiradjuri person,
It's good.
I don't necessarily I don't have connections here. I mean, I do, but I don't to the same way that, a Darug, Gadigal, person might. And so it was a lot easier, to be fair, with working with Danielle because of her connections here. So I think, working with somebody with existing connections and relationships is super important. But I think if you don't have that, it's about potentially, having a bit more time. And I think even in the Yuwaya Ngarra-li partnership, when I first started the masters, my first time going up to Walgett, I was like, okay, I have these questions. I want to do this. I want to have this outcome, blah, blah, blah. And I got there and I started to try and do it. And I just realized that, what I was trying to do was kind of force it along and through a process which it was not ready for, and that I just kind of needed just to sit with people and just like have a tea and it's, a Wiradjuri kind of philosophy, way of being, thinking, Yindiamarra, which basically means to go
Absolutely.
so slowly, thoughtfully, respectfully. And this is something that I practice as a Wiradjuri woman, but I think that we all kind of really need to practice it as well, especially when we're working with community. It's like, just kind of understanding that you do kind of need to sit with people first and just kind of start to, one, let them see who you are. Like, what is this person about? What are their intents? But also just practicing that deep listening and, just kind of sitting down and, some things just come out naturally. You don't even need to force it. And,
Totally.
sometimes
Totally.
it's
And I
about
think
kind of
you
going
hit the
back
nail on the head
another
in so many
time.
different
And
ways.
then
Like so
that's
much
when you
of
can start to
this
ask a few
meaningful
more
engagement is
questions,
about
which, you're
connection
kind of looking
first.
for. But,
and how
I
that can look
think
can be very
definitely
different. But
just time, like,
um, I think
having
you're right.
a
Like
couple
we
of
often
times
go
in order to
into
start to
community
kind
with
of
an
to build
agenda,
that relationship and
um,
not force it,
and
you know,
we learn
too
very quickly
quickly
that
to go in a certain
I've
way.
learned in the past I've done exactly the same, and then I've gone in with ambitions, and then gone, this is not how this week's going to go or this day's going to go. And you've got to be flexible, and you've got to adapt. You've got to also realize that the real significance and opportunity is in the ability to hold space and connect with community on the ground. Like that is so much more valuable than being able to tick off the items on your, meeting agenda or your goals for that day or that week that you're
Yeah,
there, um, as well. And yeah, I think that's critical for people listening because we can often be so time pressured.
yeah,
And um, I really love that you brought up the Yindiamarra philosophy and way of thinking. And yeah, it's for anyone that's listening, they can probably do a little bit of a search and learn a little bit more about that way of thinking and what way of working. But it's really how much of our communities do their business. And it is about doing work well and slow and in the most respectful of ways. And I often find that once you've got connection and engagement with community, that guidance comes through the work, right? And I'm sure you probably got that once you spent that time in community. Um, that guidance and
yeah,
advice that steered you on the journey that you were going on when you were doing that work. And so, yeah, it's almost like it's like we've been having some big yarns here at Impact Policy around like decolonizing our thinking around how we do our work, and I think that's a big part of that sort of stuff as well, is recognizing that there's actually a range of different ways that you can
yeah,
achieve the outcomes that you're trying to get in community. Um, and that there's not always like, we've got these frameworks and standards and all this sort of stuff that are sort of draft guides and principles. But at the end of the day, it really comes down to meaningful connection and relationships and recognizing the investment that comes with that
yeah.
in terms of time and energy and things like that too. So yeah, Yindiamarra, hey, there we go. I'm so glad that you brought that up. Um, my daughter's name's
Lovely.
Yindiamarra. Yeah. I um, I spent like a week with Uncle Stan Grant, um, and then like funnily enough, like um, my daughter was like born not long after that, and it just stuck. Like so, we call her Yindi, but it's like
Yeah,
Yindi
yeah.
hyphen Amara. Yes.
Um,
Yeah, there you go.
and
Yeah, very yeah.
oh, how beautiful.
Absolutely.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Cute.
Absolutely.
Yeah, it's one of my favorite words. I feel like I can use it all the time. And working in Walgett on Gamilaroi country, they have a word, like they have the same word meaning Balawa, I think it's pronounced. So I feel like every language group probably has a similar word, like with, that kind of way of thinking and being. And it just kind of shows that, it's a
Absolutely.
really important way of conducting ourselves. And, and I think that responsibility that
Mhm.
we have in order to, act in a certain way is also really important to have other people understand that when you, at least for me personally, when I
Totally.
work with a community, as soon as I start to develop a relationship with them, I'm like, I'm tied to this community now. I need to let them know what's happening. I need to make sure that their stories, their feelings, their knowledge is kind of cared for, and that, I carry it through. And I think that, if you're not Indigenous, you kind of should be doing the same things, like acting as a custodian for these communities and kind of understanding that everything that's shared with you you need to kind of carry it, but you also need to let them know how that's
Absolutely.
been
And I think that's a
taken
really critical
and
point
what's
you touch
happening with
on.
that,
I
and
think, like you
understand
said,
that, you
it
need to
should be
kind of
that way
carry and
for
care for
everybody
that
working in that space in terms of
relationship
that
and
responsibility that you take on
whatever
once you
knowledge
connect with
or
the
perspectives
community
you're
and build that
working with, and make sure
relationship.
that it's always
But
kind
it
of
is definitely
carried
something for
and fed back to the
non-Aboriginal people
community
working in this space that
consistently
are
through the
engaging
project in
professionals
order
like
to kind of make
ourselves and
sure
other
that you're
Aboriginal consultants in
developing
this
like a
area
really
is
good
that
reciprocal relationship.
we all Aboriginal people working in this space also do carry an extra load in terms of cultural responsibility back to community. And so whilst, everybody that's engaged in this stuff should be taking on that level of responsibility to community, often as blackfellas it's compounded for us. And we know that we have to, uh, in terms of cultural integrity, it's critical that we do that um, as well. And I think that's something that is for anyone listening along is something really important to take away when you're working with Aboriginal professionals in this sort of space is that added level of responsibility, not just to the project, but it's equally, if not more, I would say more probably, is the responsibility back to the communities that we're working with too. So yeah, you're really bringing out some critical points, Samantha there. So thank you so much for highlighting some of that sort of stuff. Um, I just wanted to talk about like if there was, I feel like we've touched on so many different sort of pieces when we look at this sort of space. But if there was one thing right now that could be different when you think about the space that you're working within that could have a really significant impact, um, what do you sort of think that could be
Agree.
for people that are listening along that might be in, leadership positions, decision making roles,
Yeah.
all that sort of stuff? Yep, that's it. Absolutely.
I think, I mean, more blackfellas would be great. That's obviously going to take a while, but I think also just understanding lived experience and how important lived experience is over, whatever you've kind of studied at a university, or if you haven't studied at a university at all. And so
Totally.
I think kind of taking away that kind of hierarchical kind of, I guess, kind of educational kind of bias or privilege that we tend to carry, and understand that lived experience is just as important and valuable as, somebody that, might have studied something, if not in some cases, potentially more important. And so, if we can't have built environment professionals, blackfella built environment professionals, then having
Not a
blackfellas
ramble
that,
at all.
are strong in their
It's
culture and who they
you're
are,
this is such a valuable yarn.
and,
Like,
are like knowledge holders, I think is just as important and valuable in this space, especially while, we're kind of coming together and we're trying to kind of figure out how do we actually kind of meet this demand. So, and I think I was going to say one other thing, but I think I've rambled too much that I've forgotten it. um, I think the other thing for me is that really kind of embedding, this way of thinking
yeah,
into education, because I think the problem is that at the moment you're trying to kind of have this concept, of Indigenous ways of thinking. You're trying to teach people that have, been brought up in a certain way and have all of these design philosophies and systems that really kind of are at odds with our way of kind of
absolutely.
doing and thinking and seeing. And even, as somebody that's, only kind of been working in this space for maybe 3 years, and when I was trying to kind of do my thesis, there was still like this gap or this disconnect in my mind because I was like, oh, I see architecture in on this side of the brain, and then I have this kind of cultural kind of way of seeing this other way, and I hadn't yet like connected the two. And there were just things, I had a cultural supervisor, Michael Mossman, who works at University of Sydney, and he would just say something, and I would be like, of course, that makes so much sense. It should be connected. And I think slowly over time, everything just, came together. And it must have just been, all of these synapses in my brain,
Absolutely,
just like finally kind
absolutely.
of
And
bringing the two
I
sides
completely
together.
agree.
But I
Like, I think
think
it's like
it's so
the
important that you
early,
start to kind of
yeah,
introduce
for
these
many
concepts early
professionals, I
on
imagine
in
right now that are
education
sort of
so that it's
mid-career,
not so difficult for
even early career
people.
as well,
And,
any stage really, is
because
that
I think people are
the
really
emergence
fearful of
and
doing the wrong things or
growth
don't quite
of
understand
our
it. And
space in
so the
terms
earlier
of
you bring that concept
connecting
in, the
with
easier
country and
it
embedding
is for them
Aboriginal
to kind of
perspectives in these
take
sorts of
on board
places
and
is
practice.
completely foreign, or completely new, or very early stages in that journey. And so it makes it really hard for us to see, um, I guess, significant shifts, because much of that work, well, comes back to blackfellas, and there's not a lot of us that are doing work in this sort of space. Um, you talk about education, like how can people that are curious, that are looking to try and understand this sort of space a bit more, like, can you recommend anything that might be a useful sort of tool or guide, or anything that they might be able to do?
Definitely. I mean, I think that there's
Okay.
so much, there's so many resources out there now, which I think is really amazing. I know Parla have been doing talks with Deadly Jurymen, so a whole range of amazing female Aboriginal designers and things like Blackitecture
Yeah,
down
great.
at M Pavilion, which is generally curated by Sarah Lynn Rees. Because of the changes, so we've recently had changes in the accreditation of architecture and the master's degree. So they've had to start to create CPD points, which refer to kind of making people more culturally competent in this space. So, there's a lot of resources that have come
Okay.
out recently, which have been created by, I think, Ellie Davidson and Michael Mossman around kind of this space, but also,
Yeah,
the
great. So
design book
I
by
think for anyone
Alison
listening
Page
along, we'll
and
have some
Paul Nemeth
copies
is
in the
like a
show notes
really
of all the
easy
resources
introduction.
that Sam's talked to there. But
Danielle on
there's nothing
Yindiamarra
short
website
of
has
a
all of
stepping
these
stone for
free
anyone
kind of
listening along that wants
publications
to
around,
continue on that sort of journey of
ICIP,
really,
working with country,
building their
working with
capability in this
Indigenous
sort of space.
practitioners.
And
There's
I
so
just want
much
to
out
take a
there,
moment to thank you
thankfully,
really for
that
giving up
people
your
can
time to
engage
share
with.
uh, a
Yeah.
part of what's been a really significant journey, and really um, pulling out some critical pieces for people listening along to really think about, understand, and hopefully try and reflect and bring into their own ways of working as well. I think it's I really believe that it's going to be a really valuable episode for people to connect with. And yeah, just before we wrap up, is there any sort of final thoughts or points or anything you might want to say? I try to keep. I've got a someone hammered me about my podcast being too long, so I'm really trying to keep them 45 minutes. But before we wrap out, anything else you might want to say?
Okay. Yeah, no, I get it. Um, I think just when you previously said about that extra cultural load that we have as,
Lovely.
you know, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander designers or practitioners, I think it's really important, or it would be nice that people would know is that I am always Wiradjuri person first, and I am a designer second. And so that
That's
is,
it. That's when you know
I can't
you've
speak
got
for everyone,
someone
but for
solid on the
me,
call
I
with you
know
when they're
that
talking
that is
like
how
that, Sam.
where my values
Okay?
sit. So I'm
Love
always
that.
going to be
Love that.
first a community person and
All right.
tied to a community first, and they're going to be
Hey, look, I
the
really hope
thing
we
that
can
I
connect
care
again. Maybe we
for
can catch
first,
up, get a
and then
coffee, and
second
have a
to
yarn a little
that
bit more
is,
about this sort of stuff.
what I
I'm
do for
really
work.
big fan of the work that you're doing, and
I try and make
yeah,
them
hope we can
connect, but
connect
if
again
I have to choose,
pretty
it's
soon.
always going to be
If anyone
community.
wants to
So
connect with you and
yeah.
reach out to you, what's the best way they can contact you?
Oh, thanks, Sam. Okay,
Yeah, cool. All right.
sounds
Easy
great.
one. SamanthaRich.com.au. Same thing. We'll have a list. We'll have a link to all that in the show notes as well. So, yeah, I'll let you go and thank you again for sharing some space.
Um, I have a website, so it's just samantharich.com.au. Otherwise, they can find my email on there, or LinkedIn, I guess. So yeah, Mandangu.